Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 9 studio albums recorded by the Ozzy Osbourne era Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, of course, famous heavy metal pioneers and part of the unholy trinity of bands that was Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. Sabbath formed in Birmingham in the Midlands of England in 1968. It was Terry Geezer Butler on bass guitar, Bill Ward on drums, Tony Iommi on guitar, and Ozzy Osbourne, of course, on vocals. They started as the Polka Tulk Blues Band, and then they became Earth before Tony Iommi left very, very briefly to join Jethro Tull before returning and helping the band get a record deal with Vertigo. Eventually, they released their debut album in 1970. For me, there are times when only Black Sabbath will do. They're one of those bands that you just get a feeling, you just think, oh, I must listen to some Black Sabbath. I think there's just something unique in their sound that no other band can satisfy. And that makes them quite unique, I think, in that respect. They're also almost impossibly influential. Every single metal band, and I include all the genres and subgenres in that, kind of owe a debt to Black Sabbath, really, and in particular to the Riffmeister General Tony Iommi. But look, let's get into it. So there's 9 albums, and my 9th album on this list is from 2013, and it is their reunion album, 13. Ozzy had left the band in the late 70s, and there had been all sorts of animosity in the intervening years, but somehow Sharon Osbourne managed to sort of pull them all together for a sort of intermittent reunion that lasted for a couple of years with a tour and everything. This was the album that they did when they did finally get back together, with Rick Rubin, famous producer Rick Rubin at the helm. So was it any good? Well, look, it's over an hour long. 5 of these songs are over 7 minutes. Bill Ward isn't drumming. The official line was that he wasn't healthy enough to drum. Who knows? Maybe we may never find out the truth. So Brad Wilk is in on drums on this. But I think this is a good example of modern technology really dissipating the essence of a band. For me, it was kind of that lo-fi, not perfectly produced sound that's really added something to Sabbath's oral mystery and darkness. You know, for me, they were kind of always the sort of the dark, plain side of the Oreo cookie compared to sort of Led Zeppelin's sort of sugary, shiny upper side. There's an analogy there for the Americans watching. But here they kind of just sound like so many other bands that they influenced. The songs I find a little bit stodgy and uninspired. There's none of those really beautiful melodies that creep into Sabbath's music, you know, when you least expect them to, and they are littered all throughout Sabbath albums, particularly the early ones. Look, it's not a bad album, but it's certainly the Ozzy Sabbath album I go back to the least. From number 8, from 1978, their 8th album. This was Never Say Die, and this was the final album they made with the classic lineup. Now, the band was under threat from all sides, financially, legally, musically, personally. And you know, as I've said before about music in the late 70s with regards rock bands, they were all really struggling to find their place in what was happening. You know, there was punk, there was new wave, there was disco. It was changing so fast, and so many bands really didn't know what they should be doing, whether they should be following the herd or doing their own thing or even trying something completely new. One of the problems for Sabbath was that they were just a bit too heavy for AOR radio. Now, a lot of other bands that had the same problem managed to find their home on AOR radio, and it was in many respects their saviour. But Sabbath, just for a lot of their stuff, was just too heavy for it. So things were difficult for them. The drugs, the drink was seriously starting to take their toll. they had to record this album in Canada, in Toronto, for tax reasons. So they went to a studio they didn't really know. They found it very, very disappointing. The sound was very, very dead. And the sound on this album is unrefined. That said, it's quite a quirky record songwriting-wise. I quite like Air Dance, and you've got Don Airey coming in, doing some wonderful piano all over that. But it doesn't seem to have a focus, and it does feel a bit disjointed. And like the band at the time, it really isn't the sound of a unit playing or working together, I don't think. In seventh place, from 1976, their seventh album, Technical Ecstasy. So all sorts of personal issues had been boiling and simmering, and the band needed to get away, have a more relaxing environment to record to. So they went to Miami Beach to record this. Well, the problem here is that three of the band ended up on the beach all day, chilling and having a great time, leaving Tony Iommi at the helm to produce the record. And this really did create an atmosphere. Tony Iommi was determined to sort of take Black Sabbath in a new direction, but he didn't know what direction that was. At time he's been quoted as saying he thought the band should sort of go in a Queen style direction, at other times like Foreigner. And Geezer Butler says that this is really the album where everything started to fall apart. The reviews were lukewarm at best, calling it really confused. Bill Ward even pops up with a perfectly acceptable vocal on the song It's All Right. But Rock and Roll Doctor, Backstreet Kids, are they great songs? No, I don't think they are. They don't have any of that early Sabbath vibe that really made me fall in love with the band, and that makes them, special and unique. And let's not forget, bands like AC/DC were emerging, just all ready to take Sabbath's place on the hard rock throne. But number 6 from 1975, their 6th album, Sabotage. This album the band was having to divide their time between the studio and lawyers' offices because there's all sorts of stuff going on. They felt they were being absolutely ripped off by management and all sorts of other people, left, right, and centre. And that's why the album's called Sabotage. You just have to look at the song titles: The Writ, Am I Going Insane, Megalomania. It's all fairly clear what's happening here. There's a lot of anger on this record. It's raw. It comes out in the music, which is raw and heavier than the previous records to this one. In a way, this is kind of Sabbath's punky record, and this is kind of a year before punk even broke. So, who knows? It was the first Sabbath album not to go platinum in the US. There's an element of weariness on this record as well. And a perfect analogy for Sabbath's kind of frail grip on control of reality is there on the album cover, where nobody noticed that Bill Ward, who was wearing his wife's underpants for the album cover, that you could actually see them through what he was wearing. Ozzy sings pretty well on this record, I think, but look, let's move on to what I think is the real meat of the Black Sabbath sandwich. So at number 5, from 1972, their 4th album, Volume 4, produced by Tony Iommi, and sonically, immediately you can hear that, there's somebody with a slightly different perspective on things at the helm, because as soon as Wheels of Confusion kicks in, you've got the stereo guitars, you've got the reverb there. It's impossibly weighty, and that adds such a drama as soon as the album kicks in. This album was famously recorded in a blizzard of the white stuff, and the album famously thanks the Coca-Cola Company of America. And of course, you've got Snowblind on here, which is speaks for itself. Ozzy finds this album quite hard to recall, which was a familiar theme with a lot of albums and things in Ozzy's life, if you read his autobiography. The most famous song in here is probably Changes, a very, very sweet, unsabbathy ballad. It was great on the record, and then many, many years later, when Ozzy was doing the Osbournes and became a household name, he re-recorded it with his daughter Kelly, and it went to number 1. Laguna Sunrise, I love. Another great example of those moments of beauty and delicacy that Sabbath throw into their music. This is Tony Iommi on the Spanish guitar, looking at a sunrise and writing about it. It's very, very lovely. St. Vitus Dance, to me, sounds like a sort of Bowie and the Spiders from Mars offcut. I love it. some of the heavier songs not quite hitting the sweet spot that they had done before. But there's undeniably brilliant riffs all throughout this record, things like Under the Sun, Snowblind. There are a lot of fans who really, really love this album, and I get that. I totally get that. I just think there was, slightly better albums elsewhere. And one of them was the band's debut album at number 4 from 1970, Black Sabbath. So this is regarded as the first heavy metal album. And I think that you had bands like the Kinks had rock riffs, and Hendrix had been doing stuff, and Blue Cheer and things like that. But I think if you take heavy metal as a definition of a music that also brings in all these other kind of, the sort of satanic symbolism and this sort of stuff as well, then this is certainly the first heavy metal record. The band took its name, Black Sabbath. Geezer Butler went to see the film Black Sabbath and came back and said, let's call the band Black Sabbath. And then with that just came this whole sort of, this whole world of imagery that sort of, that was worked very, very well for the band, but also eventually became quite wearisome for them as well. But it's also important to look at what happened to Tony Iommi and how the band's sound came about. Famously, it's the factories and the industrial sounds of Birmingham that inspired the heavy metal sound. Apparently, you'll hear Judas Priest talk about that as well, and even the guys from ELO. But probably the most important thing that happened was Tony Iommi was working in one of these factories, and he chopped the end of his fingers off. The very tips of his fingers off in a sheet metal factory, and he thought he wouldn't be able to play the guitar again, but he ended up being given a cassette of Django Reinhardt, the famous gypsy jazz guitarist who also had lost fingers. And Tony Iommi was inspired to keep going, so he got some washing up bottles and he moulded them to the tips of his fingers so that he could still play. What he did have to do, and this is crucial though, is he had to loosen the strings by detuning the guitar to make it easier for him to fret. And when you do that, you make the sound weightier, you make it a bit more turgid and a bit more dragged down. Now, I use those words in a positive way because it all gave rise to the Sabbath sound. Now, of course, pretty much every metal band, grunge metal band, detunes, but Sabbath were the first to do it on this scale, producing this kind of dramatic effect. You combine that with the beginning of this album, the tolling of the bells, and you're thinking, wow, something wicked this way comes. Because the first riff on the first song is the famous Devil's Triad. The 3 notes that were so considered so scary, they were banned in medieval Europe. So, you can imagine, a young kid absorbing all this stuff, just going, wow, I want in. This is so exciting. You've got Geezer's vivid lyrics, inspired by film, religion, the devil, outsiders. It's essentially still a blues rock album, like so many debut albums from this era are. But the songs are brilliant. Black Sabbath, the title track, NIB, Wizard. It got slagged off in the press, people calling the band an inferior cream, which is just ludicrous. They were just coming from totally different place. Some critics, honestly. There's a saying, nobody ever made a statue out of a critic. And ain't that the truth? Went top 10 in the UK and top 30 in the USA, and this really was the beginning of a whole new musical revolution. But at number 3, their third album from 1971, Master of Reality. So this album begins with a cough from Tony Iommi on a loop. He'd just taken a massive drag of a spliff and coughed into the microphone. They decided to keep it because that's what Sabbath do. And Bill Ward talks of a bigger sound on this album, more experimentation, moving a little bit away from the traditional band format Sabbath had, just guitar, bass and drums. So there's a little bit more instrumentation on here. There's some classical guitar, stuff like that. Lyrically, I think Geezer Butler is much more confident. He's much more confident about what his lyrics and Ozzy's voice can do together. It's still the same old themes, war, religion, drugs, that kind of stuff. Album went top 10 both sides of the Atlantic and sold over 2 million copies. Sweet Leaf is the classic opener. After Forever is great. Children of the Grave. Children of the Grave is pure Iron Maiden. If you want to hear where some of these later heavy metal bands just got their inspiration, just go and listen to these early Sabbath albums. Children of the Grave is classic Iron Maiden. It's a great record, and I think really by this stage, although they'd had the hit on the album preceding it, this is really the album where Sabbath matured, I think is possibly the way. Thinking of Black Sabbath and being mature, it sounds like a juxtaposition to me, but listen to the album and you kind of get what I mean, I think. At number 2, from 1973, their 5th album, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. So the band rented a house in Bel Air while they were recording this, and you can just imagine what happened. So there were all kinds of late parties, hangers-on, people bringing in illegal substances, the nefarious activities going on. Tony Iommi was under a lot of pressure to come up with more riffs. It was the riffs that inspired the Sabbath songs, and he had dried up. And being in Bel Air wasn't helping at all. So what better to do than to inspire the heavy metal juices than relocate to a castle in England? So they ended up doing exactly that. And then one evening, Tony Iommi was playing guitar and he ended up coming out with the riff to Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, one of the pivotal, iconic Black Sabbath songs. When the rest of the band heard that, they all thought, we're back! And sure enough, the floodgates opened and Tony Iommi ended up writing all these fantastic riffs. This is the album where tensions were really starting to bubble over. It was the pressure on Tony Iommi to write riffs, the pressure on Geezer Butler to write lyrics, Ozzy's general all-round behaviour, and Bill Ward was complaining that he had no social life. But you can't really hear it on this record. It's a great record. They're experimenting, there's synths, bagpipes, strings, flutes, sitars, all kinds of things buried in the music, some more obviously than others. And really, you know, the title track on this album, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, is absolutely pivotal because it starts with it's a classic Sabbath. It starts with a great riff, and then the chorus is one of those moments of just real beauty that people just seem to ignore that Sabbath were capable of. It's lovely, a really lovely melody. But then at 3 minutes 20, and there are a lot of heavy metal guitarists who will know exactly what I'm talking about, the riff kicks in. This is a riff that has been ripped off, copied, parodied, by just about every grunge, thrash, whatever, scuzz metal, whatever genre you want to say, from Metallica to Slayer to everybody in between. It's just one of those drop D riffs that whenever we all play drop D and play the guitar, we just all fall into this kind of riff. And Tony Iommi got there first. This was the first Black Sabbath album to kind of uniformly get great reviews. I think by now people had kind of accepted them or forgiven them or realized, what kind of trajectory they had been on and thought, actually, I'm kind of into this. I'm enjoying it. Anyway, my number 1 Black Sabbath album is from 1917. I'm sure you've sussed it by now. Paranoid. So sensing they were onto a good thing, Vertigo decided to throw Sabbath back into the studio only 4 months after their debut had come out. The band was confident and they thought they'd be more ambitious with the arrangements, with the lyrics. And this album really has an absolute killer side 1. I mean, the whole album's great, but the side 1 of this album is absolutely monster. It starts, of course, with War Pigs, one of the most iconic of all Black Sabbath songs, which they opened their show with for many, many years. When I did go and see Sabbath, I was still in the bar when they opened this. I'm kind of proud and embarrassed to say at the same time, so I missed most of it. Anyway, Paranoid, Iron Man, Planet Caravan. Again, Planet Caravan, there's moments of kind of stoned, trippy loveliness that they threw into their albums in the early days. It's Electric Funeral. I mean, it's just full of great songs. It's the only UK #1 album for 40 years until they released 13 back in 2013. Parent, they didn't have a hit single on this record, and I don't think they particularly even wanted one or thought about it, but the record company was demanding one. So Tony Iommi sort of disappeared to the corner of the studio, and within minutes he'd come out with the riff to Paranoid, and the rest is heavy metal history. Rolling Stones 131st greatest album of all time, and many other accolades besides. I think this is, and I say this about a lot of the #1 albums I choose, I think this is the perfect distillation of Black Sabbath. And the lovely thing about these early albums is they're not very long either. They sound great on vinyl because they're all just about under 40 minutes long, and this one sounds fabulous. But the Ozzy era Sabbath, as I said earlier, it wasn't to last. He was eventually booted out for his behaviour in the late 70s and replaced by diminutive hard rock wailer Ronnie James Dio. They went on to make Heaven and Hell, which actually was a fantastic record and would feature very highly in this list. And I may do a Ronnie James Dio show at some point in the future, because he did make some good records. But then there was a kind of a ludicrous sort of revolving door of members after that for many years that included Ian Gillan, Glenn Hughes, Bev Bevan. Just you know, a crazy number of people coming in and out. And I think the public kind of lost interest to a point until really Ozzy rejoined the band in 2013. And now, of course, Black Sabbath's legacy is assured, as just about everybody recognises the impact they've had on heavy metal music particularly. But look, there it is, my Ozzy era Black Sabbath albums reviewed and ranked. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure you don't completely agree, and if you don't, then please say so, and we can talk about it in the comments below. But I will see you again soon for another Rock Records review. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.